Howdy YouTube parts, Jack Spade coming back at you today, High Noon Leatherworks. Today, this episode is going to deal with the Hand of God holster and stitching. So we're to the point now, we've got our dyeing, all of our carving, all of our stamping done. Now we're to the point where we're ready to do our stitching. So come on in and let's get started. Alright, got my holster secured in my stitching horse, and I always put a piece of scrap leather on each side of my piece that I'm going to stitch, because I don't want to put any scarring or anything, or smash my carving on this side. So I put a scrap piece on each side, and then I clamp it down, make sure that it's in there snug. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pick out the thread that I'm going to use. Now we're going to use a light color artificial sinew, and that'll make that stitch pop on that dark brown that we used as the dye on this holster. And if you look at the pictures of the Hand of God holster, it does have a lighter color stitch, so it does make it stick out. And a lot of this stitching around here, the hold down strap back here, is decorative. It's not, I'm not sewing two pieces together like I will here on this part when I get to that part. So I'm going to start here and go around, and then come back down. When I hit this side where this is going to start stitching together, where I roll it over, then I'll start stitching those two pieces together, and I'll show you that. And then when I get down here to the bottom, that way I can hide my stitch inside the holster, my finished stitch, my knot. So I'll go ahead and pick out a couple of needles here, and we'll get started. When you're measuring your string or your stitching material, whether it's sinew or synthetic, artificial sinew, whatever it is, I always like to go 4 times the length of what my stitching area is. So you can start it anywhere you want, and you take it around. And with not putting two pieces together all the way around, some of it just being decorative stitching, it probably won't take as much, but I want to make sure that I have plenty, because I like for this to end up being one complete piece of stitching thread or whatever I'm using. So there's one complete round, and you can see that that's pretty long. So what I want is 4 times that to make sure that I have plenty. So I'll double that over, and then pull that thread out. That's 3 times. And then I'll come back and pull that out, and that'll be 4 times. Now, that does become a little cumbersome at first when you first get started, probably about the first half. And then I'll go about 4 more inches to make sure. And I'll cut that off of my spool. And the reason it's a little cumbersome when you first start off is because your thread's so long. So there's a way to help with that. And the way to do that is when you thread your needle, go ahead and thread both ends, or both needles, both ends of the thread, because I'm going to do saddle stitching, so I'm going to use 2 needles, one on each end of the thread, is go ahead and pull these ends down pretty far. And then make sure they match so that when you end at the, get to the very end, you're going to have the same amount of material on both needles. So just pull it down and make sure they match. Pretty close. So you can see pretty close there. And then I always just fold this over. Some people bring it back through the loop, the eye of the needle. Some people put it through the tip of the needle. I've done it that way too. It works. But when you have this much, um, it works just as well, especially with waxed thread. I always use waxed thread because I think it gives you a much more secure stitch. But when you have waxed thread, it also helps keep those pieces of thread or sinew together as you're stitching, so it doesn't flop around, kind of sticks together a little bit, ends up being more like 2 strands instead of 4 there. So I still have a pretty long piece of sinew, but it's probably about 2/3 shorter than the whole entire piece just by folding that over through the eye of the needle and pulling it down. Now, as I use this up and it gets shorter and it gets to the end of that point, then all I have to do is pull more thread through my needle and then fold it over again and stick it together, and I can just keep going until I get to the very end. So that seems to work for me as far as doing about 4 times the amount of the entire stitching area. So I'll go around and I'll kind of measure that with a piece of thread, and then I take 4 times that amount. So what I'm going to do to start, I want my last stitch here on this part of the holster where this kind of comes up to a little rounded point. There is a hole in the very point of that, and that's where I'm going to start my stitch on the other side when I fold it over, when I get down to this point. Now I'm going to have to mark that when I get close over here so that I know where to start stitching those together. I don't want to get way past that and then find out, oh, I went too far, now I'm going to have to take those stitches out, and that becomes a real pain. So since that's going to be my starting stitch for when I fold the holster over and actually stitch these 2 sides together, I'm going to start this decorative stitch here that goes up and around. I'm going to start it in the second hole. So the first hole away from that point, or that top dead center, if you want to call it that, I'm going to go ahead and pull that through, and I want to get my needles even. And that way I have the same amount of thread on both sides of my holster. Now again, I'm not actually sewing 2 pieces of leather together at this point. I'm just going around and doing this decorative stitch that's going around this part. Once I get over here to where this begins, to where I sew it together, then that'll change. So I'll go ahead and uh, start. I'm going to go ahead and get my small needle nose out in case I need to pull that one of those needles through. I'll keep those handy because I'm doing a saddle stitch. So like to begin, I'll go to the next hole and I'll pull that one all the way through and then stop. Don't keep pulling or you'll pull this other thread on the other side through, and you don't want to do that. So that one I can lay on my workbench or just let it drop and pick it back up. I find it's easier for me if I lay it on a workbench or a toolbox or something I have handy there. Now I'll pull on that a little bit toward me, and then I'll push my second needle or the other end of the thread through the same hole. Now this is where it gets a little, sometimes a little tight, and I keep these small needle nose pliers handy, and I just grab a hold of the end of my needle. I try to stay away from the eye of the needle because that's where it's the thinnest. Out here where it's fat though, I'll grab a hold of it and then just push with my fingers on the needle nose, and that normally pops it right through. And sometimes, depending on what type of punch you have for your stitching holes, you may need to clean those holes up, especially like I punch them and then I die. So sometimes when you die it after that, it kind of shrinks those holes up a little bit. So you may need to kind of clean those up, and that'll help open them up. Go ahead and pull, once you get it all the way through, pull both ends snug, and then I'm ready to go to the next hole. Pull that all the way through. Again, just snug. Don't want to torque down on it. And then I'll grab that, pull it back toward me, and push the needle through the other side. And that's the second needle on the other end of the thread. And again, it's a little stiff pulling it through there, so I'll grab a hold of the fat part of the needle with my tiny needle nose and push on my thumb on the needle nose, and it pops it right through. So this is one of those things that after a while, once you get going, you can kind of get a little rhythm to. Again, every time you complete that cycle and you put both needles through, you want to snug both ends of those threads up, and that what that does is that pulls your stitch tight. And with that being wax thread, that's gonna probably after your second stitch, it's gonna stay there. It's not gonna loosen back up when you let go. So I am going to move my clamp. I notice I put my clamp on really backwards. You could do it either way, but if I leave it like I had it, it's just kind of, the handle's in my way. So I'll put the handle on the back side so it doesn't get in the way of my stitching. Grab my first needle again, go through the front side, pull it through. Again, just barely snug. Pull that thread toward the front or toward me. And what that does is it gets that thread out of the way of the second needle so you don't split your thread when you're going through. So it opens up that hole so your needle goes through without splitting that thread. And I think I mentioned this on my last video or maybe 2 videos ago about I do have a machine. It's a hand crank sewing machine, leather sewing machine, but it's not what I consider real high quality as far as keeping your stitches exactly perfect. And when you do this saddle stitching by hand, your stitches are perfect every time. So I prefer using the hand saddle stitch, especially on things like this, like a holster or a bag or a knife sheath or something like that that's really gonna need to hold up. Um, a checkbook cover, a wallet, which is normally a thinner type leather, I'll use my machine. So, and it does fine for that. So again, take the needle, pass it through the front, next hole in the front, pull it, snug it down, grab your second needle on the other end of the thread, pull the first thread that's through towards you, stick your needle through. And I find if it is difficult to get that through there, and I use my small needle nose pliers to grab that needle, I don't break as many needles down at the eye. If I really try to force that through with my hand, you kind of end up twisting it or turning it. If I use needle nose, I know I'm keeping it pretty straight as I'm pushing out on it. So I don't break as many needles that way either. Again, I'm going to come through the front, pick up my second needle, pull that first thread toward me, stick that needle through, and I am using round needles. I have other types of leather needles, but it seems these work really well for me. So I'm just going to keep doing this and continue until I get all the way around to where I have to fold this over and start stitching that together. So I'll go all the way around this, and then I'll come back when I have to the point over here where I'm going to start stitching these together, and I'll bring you guys back. Okay, so I've got all the decorative stitching done around the back strap, and I've got to the point now where um, I'm starting to close up the holster. I've got around to that point. So I brought you back in. We'll go ahead and start saddle stitching down through the back part or the backbone of this uh, holster. So I'll continue lining up up these holes. Sometimes it can be a little tough lining them up perfect, but again, it's one of those things, just take your time and they'll line up. You have to kind of squeeze that holster, just keep molding it a little bit as you go down the stitch line, and that'll help line those stitches up too. You could always take another needle or a small awl and stick it through there and line those holes up. You could do it down here. You could actually take whatever you punched your stitching holes with, you could stick that through there, just kind of hold it. That would probably help. Or you could even take some of these small clamps, plastic clamps, and pull that together. And you're not, these things are real cheap. They don't have a lot of pressure on them. But all that's going to do is just kind of keep that together, make it easier to get your needle through there and keep them lined up. See, as much, just that little bit was much easier to get that needle lined up with those holes and pull it through there. Now it does kind of make it a little cumbersome with those in your way. I don't know if you can pull them down a little bit, kind of pull them out of your way. So I'll continue to stitch this, and then when I get down to the finished edge, I'll bring you back. Okay, so I've got this stitched all the way around, got the holster stitched up down the seam, stitched around the toe. Now I came down to tying my knot, and there's my 2 strings that I had left. I didn't have a lot left, but I've got plenty. So I'll tie a knot. That'll be hidden in that toe right at the end of that seam. Now I'll take a knife, or you can take scissors. I like to leave just a little bit hanging off of there. Then I'll take something that I can push on. I tell you what, normally I use my needle nose pliers. and take my lighter and light that, and that will melt that wax. And then I can push on those ends, and it flattens the ends of that thread out so that knot's not going to come undone. And it hides that thread up in there. So not only hides the thread, but keeps the knot from ever coming apart because it flattens out the ends with that wax on it. So let me take this out of here. There's the stitched. And then we'll have, next episode we'll be mounting the hold down strap. And it'll be finished up. So one last episode to finish this holster, and we'll have the hand of God ready to go. So it's going to turn out really good. So there you go. We've got all the stitching done now, and the next episode should be the last episode where we wrap this thing up and put on the hold down strap and finish the holster. So come on back for that, and I appreciate you watching. And please do me a huge favor and tell your friends about the channel and have them subscribe. And I would ask that you like and you share. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. I would appreciate it. So until next time, we'll see you.